everybody. Welcome to the Better Sex Podcast. My name is Deborah Cat, and I am your shameless host. This is the Better Sex Podcast, where we have unfiltered conversations about sex and relationships. This show is about the many different ways that we do and have sex and create relationship. This is for people who want to have better sex on their terms. I truly believe that a sexy world creates a happier, healthier, and safer world. And if you want to do your part in creating a healthy, happy, safer world, please hit subscribe, comment, and like. Today, my guest is M. Kawe Hashiki. She is a Somatic Sacred Storyteller, an Erotic Ritualist. She holds certifications in Sexological Bodywork, sound, voice, and music healing, and Tantric Sacred Intimacy. As a Somatic Sacred Storyteller, she helps you uncover the stories your body is holding on to and jettison the ones that are poisoning you. She helps you to reframe and retell the ones that are left. As an erotic ritualist, she designs journeys for you to communicate with the divine, using your physical pleasure as a conduit of communication. Her divine purpose is helping folks heal their erotic wounds so they can have a joyous, juicy life that is their divine birthright and move further along their individual path for collective liberation. In her nomadic travels across North and Central America, she teaches colleges, universities, conferences, and the occasional adult toy store or educational center. She offers sexuality training and employee wellness team building skills to organizations and companies. She's also a skilled sensitivity reader hired to read manuscripts to make sure they avoid explicit or implicit systemic bias. Her lived experiences as a fat, Black, queer, femme, trauma survivor inform every aspect of her work. Check out her site, Fierce Passions, as a somatic cyber temple, offering community journeys, rituals, individual coaching, and instructional videos. She also offers private sessions for couples, triads, and guided visualizations to help us survive and thrive during these chaotic times. I am super excited to have you here. I have known you as a person from the Bay Area for many, many years, and I've gotten to watch your progress through many different incarnations. And I'm so thrilled that you're here today. And I just want to say from my heart, thank you for joining me. And I am so curious. I want to hear all about your story and how did you get here?
Oh, wow. Okay. So you're probably going to have to rein me in at some point, and I will try to give the most succinct version of how I got here. So, and I've repeated this many times because it really is key to how I got here. So I'm a Scorpio, and except for the mean part, which is all October Scorpios, we'll just say I'm a November Scorpio. I'm stereotypical when it comes to sex and what some folks might call intensity. And so I was very precocious. I created my own vibrator at like age 12. I had sex for the first time with another person, consensual sex pretty early on in my life. And at some point in my teen years, so I was having a PIV mode, penis and vagina male orgasm sex. So I was having sort of head sex and enjoying very much the experience of being fucked, but not actually orgasming, which, as we know, is very common. And it still exists. There's a magazine for the Black women community or the community of Black women called Essence. My mother used to have had a subscription to Essence. In the front of the magazine, you know, every magazine has like the editor's page or the letter from the editor. And at the time, and she still does, she's still around, Susan L. Taylor, that's her name. She had cornrows for that part of her hair, like I guess from her hairline till about the middle of her head, and then just long braids. And at the end of the braids, she has beads. And this was way before Bo Derek was a thing. Anyway, on her letters to the editors page, and I keep asking my Facebook friends, like an old copy of Essence so I can get this drawing, and nobody responds. So she had this drawing. So the letter to the editors was a 2-page sort of thing. And the beginning of the drawing was on the left-hand side, and it was just her, it was her profile. And it was just black and white. There was no colors. And so it started like with her nose, and then like her face and her cornrows, and then her braids were streaming out behind her. And as you moved from the left to the right, so it started off being her braids, and by the time you got to the right, it was the universe, the cosmos. And at some point, I don't remember how this came up. Maybe I was visiting and like going through old essence. I don't remember. But I was like, that is what happens to me when I'm having the kind of sex that I want to be having. Like the back of my head is the universe. The universe is flowing through me. And I realized early on that one of the ways to have that experience, as long as I had like a partner that was respectful and cared about my pleasure, blah, blah, blah. One of the ways to have that experience was to open, and you know, I didn't have this languaging then, but was to open a conduit, a channel between my cunt and my mouth. And so that whatever the pleasure that I was experiencing in my cunt would sort of come out of my mouth. And if that was happening, then that is what would facilitate this sort of opening of the back of my head being into the cosmos. And so in my early 20s, I realized that. Didn't really know what I was going to do. You know, didn't know that that was going to have any bearing whatsoever on my life. And then I came out as queer, or I came out as a lesbian in 1986. Yeah, that's not right, 1986. And I moved to DC, and I ended up becoming friends with people who were quite big influences in the queer community. So I became friends with people like Lorraine Hutchins and Lani Kulomanu and other bisexual activists. Many years later, after I left DC, Lorraine was really one of the people that sort of restarted this sacred horror movement based on some grad school work that she was doing. And so because we still got in touch, I got to read her thesis, dissertation, I don't know what you call it, but I got to read it, and I was like, oh, sacred horde, oh, like sex and spirit and sex as a way to communicate. Oh, and then there were people who like had this responsibility for, oh, okay, I'm understanding this. This feels like really resonant. Still not really knowing what to do with that. And then around that time, I was living in DC, and my wife at the time and I had started a lesbian and bi women's SM group. And I forgot where I was going with this. Oh, okay. So we started this lesbian SM group. And my wife at the time had a lot of experience in SM. And when we met, I had no official, safe, sane, and consensual negotiating. Like I didn't have that type of SM experience, but I had done like kinky shit with my boyfriend prior. So anyway, so we started this group, and then like a bunch of stuff happened. Blah, blah, blah. And anyway, at some point, it became clear that we were, and again, at the time, I wasn't necessarily using this languaging, but it became clear that us as a couple and me individually, that there is a way that I was helping people use sexual pleasure to see God, for lack of a better term. And that not only was it a thing I was doing, but it was also a thing that people were attracted to me and my partner for. Like there was a woman, maybe you're listening to this, and I hope you get in touch with me because I wonder what's going on with you. But anyway, she was a Druid, and we had another contract sub, and she approached us about becoming a contract sub, and she said, I'm a Druid and I've lost my voice. And I feel like you will help me regain my voice by being in submission to you guys. Oh, that would have been a good story. I'm taking Spanish classes, and I ended up going down this whole road with my Spanish teacher last week. And so my homework for today was supposed to be to tell my favorite story of my like Leatherdyke era. What is it? La época, la época. The phrase I settled on that was as close to Leatherdyke as I could get is lesbianas de cuero, which I do not think, I think it means lesbians of the leather, which is not quite the same thing. But anyway, I was supposed to tell a story, and now I'm like, this story would have been a good story. So anyway, so we went to Michigan with this person. She was not fully in contract to us during Michigan. I think maybe we had eased the contract up for Michigan so that she could like go and do whatever she wanted. And I just remember we had like a little conversation between the two of us, me and my wife at the time, and we ended up like tying her to this tree and doing all these things. And needless to say, she found her voice and was able to communicate with her God. And still, I'm like, okay, so this is a thing I do. This is a thing that I feel like I'm put on this earth to do, help people communicate with God using sexuality or their physical pleasure as a conduit. What the hell do I do with that? I don't know. I don't know what to do with that. And then I ended up moving to San Francisco. And how did I discover the body electric? I don't know how I discovered the body electric. Somehow I wound up at the body electric. I started going to some of their events, and then I actually worked for them for a little while in the office. Another time I was the coordinator of the women's events for Oakland. And then Joseph Kramer, who had started the Body Electric, Joseph Kramer and Chester Maynard, who did the massage training. Joseph had started studying at Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco, and had met the guy who wrote the book Anal Pleasure. He's a shrink. He's a psychiatrist or psychologist. I can't remember his name. Anyway, Joseph Kramer was studying at Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality and had met this guy. And I think they were reading his book as part of the curriculum. And so the guy who'd written the book, because he was in San Francisco, right? Like San Francisco, you got your alternative healers, you got your body workers, you got your massage therapists, whatever. So the guy who wrote the book, whose name is completely escaping me right now, did sex therapy. And so because of the limitations of sex therapy, traditional sex therapy, which is all talk, and he was really like, okay, so I can talk to these people, and then we get to this point, and then there has to be some experiential stuff. And so he had basically ended up like recruiting some of his body worker friends, and like with really strict guidelines, had sort of roped them into seeing some of his sex therapy clients. And then Joseph heard about that, and I'm probably messing up the story completely, but basically then Joseph did the work to go to the California Department of Secondary Education with a curriculum, and he created the field of sexological bodywork. So I was like, oh, sounds interesting. And I had met Chester prior to that and had like fallen, I don't know what the word, in love. I mean, there's different types of love, but like the love, like when you meet a fucking prophet and you're like, this person is dialed into the universe and is speaking deep universal truth. And then you're just like, whoa, I am blessed to have met this person. And then you like fall in love with them. So that I got into my like first Chester Maynard, it was Massage 101, Massage 101. And I was just like, oh. And so then that summer, I just took like every fucking class that he taught. And then that fall, maybe that fall, time has no meaning. At some point in there, they launched, or they had already started the first round of sexological body workers, and I was off doing something else. I don't know what I was doing. So then when it's time for the second round of sexological body workers, I was like, oh, I want in on that. And so I started doing such a sexological bodywork training, and it gave me a structure. First of all, it gave me languaging to describe sort of my experiences before. Joseph Kramer uses this term, erotic ecstatic, people who are able to reach states of ecstasy, ecstatic states. And by ecstatic states, I mean like the way we think of like when we talk about like spiritual ecstasy. Like I'm not specifically only talking about physical, like states of intense physical pleasure. I'm talking about like spiritual states of ecstasy. So people who can reach those states of ecstasy through physical pleasure, through sexual activity, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, erotic ecstatic, that's me. And so it gave me a languaging to sort of not hang my identity on, but to understand my experiences and my skills and my interpretation of the universe. And then it gave me skills. And so I think the thing that studying with Chester, even when we went to do the massage, the CMT training, which was 100 hours, that 2 weeks, 100 hours. And the first 2 days, we didn't do any touching. We just did breath work for 2 days. And then we got into like learning different techniques. And then he said, anyone who had done the first one, if you wanted to come to his next training and just for the breathwork days, you could do that. So I went back to breathwork. And the breathwork was the most profound, simple, yet incredibly intense, like the biggest bang for your buck in terms of transformation and healing was breathwork. And I was just blown away by its simplicity, its power, the different states of consciousness that could be achieved by it. And so when I became a certified sexological bodyworker, the breath was still the foundational modality. And that brings us to 2007, I think. That brings us to 2007. And then I personally am profoundly affected by music. And I stumbled onto one of the initial trainings for CIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, their sound, voice, and music healing program. And so I did that, and then I was like, oh, I can understand how those things can be integrated into a healing session. I don't use music very much now, but when I was doing in-person body work, I did have the client use their voice for toning as part of the healing session. But I don't use a lot of outside sound.
It's so interesting that like voice and sound has been such a big part of your journey. And I'm just struck by literally, I think one of the very first things you said was like having sound and voice come from your cunt, from your pussy, from your genitals.
Oh, I didn't even make that connection. Thank you. Yes. It's very old and primal. And I was just talking to somebody recently where we were talking about the difference between nonverbal and pre-verbal as applies to sex. Like many conversations that I get into around sex, I don't know how they start, but we were talking about something and I said, my sex partners, because I'm having the sex that I want to be having. I used to use the phrase, and my partners would use the phrase nonverbal. And then at some point I was like, no, that's not it. It's pre-verbal. It's pre-words. So it's like vocalizations that are a mode of communication prior to humans creating words. And there's something very primal, very like
grounding.
Yeah, I keep making that. It's like something deep under the surface, something like deep healing, deep connection that happens through sound, because sound minus words is when you bring the mind into it, the brain into it, that has all these interpretations of what things mean and can change what things mean based on the messages that it's getting from outside media, blah, 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 blah. But prior to words, sound communicates so much that don't have to be like, when we try to translate them into words, sometimes things get lost, because in some ways what we're doing is shrinking those emotions, those feelings, those experiences. Like in order to translate them into human speech, we shrink them. Whereas if we're just like, it's just making tones with the body, then the entirety of that experience, the entirety of that emotion the entirety of that sensation really can be communicated in its fullness. And there's just sometimes I feel like, I'm very comfortable with words, but I also feel like there's a way in which they prescribe. Is that the word I mean? Prescription. There's a way in which when you put a word to something, you make it small. And so using music, using sounds of the body allow for a larger, more full, larger, grander, bigger, universal.
I love that. So I just want to pull together a couple different themes that we've been talking about here.
All over the place.
So first of all, you mentioned Michigan, and I'm thinking you're talking about Michigan Women's Festival.
Yes, the Michigan Women's Festival. I went for many years. I started going in 1991, and I think my last year was 2003, and I think I only missed 1 year.
Is that still happening?
You're gonna have to bring me in because I will just get on a rant and won't be able to hold myself back. So
maybe
it's not still happening.
Okay, got it. And then so the reason I just wanted to talk about that for a moment is because that is such a big part of women's culture. I mean, I know for me during like the late 80s through the 90s, that was like,
I think it's the 70s is when 70s, maybe late. I don't know exactly when Mishfest started, but like women's music as a force to rally a community around came out of the 70s and late 70s, early 80s. I don't know exactly when Mishfest started.
Oh, I was just going to say, and one of the places where I know it was really important was like, at least for me and some of my crew, were like starting to learn about our bodies, starting to learn about our pleasure, like in ways that we never saw reflected back in popular culture. So it was just like, there's a place where, so that's one of my big associations is,
Were you there? Did you used to go to the Twilight Zone?
Yeah.
So I'll just say that me and my gang, shout out to 90s Mishfest Twilight Zone folks. So the year I started going to Michigan was the year after they basically kicked the SM Dykes out of their main camp and where they used to have parties in the big tents, sort of in, what do we used to call it, downtown? Like where all the stuff was happening. So prior to the year I started coming, the Leather Dykes would, at night when the big workshop tents weren't being used, would like commandeer one of them to have like great big play parties. And then they would put women along the perimeter and on the path so that if somebody other folks were like wandering at night, somebody would come out of the path and be like, just so you know, if you continue along this path, you may hear and see things that may be upsetting to you, blah, blah, and here's another path so you can go this way. I ended up trying to describe the lesbian sex wars in Spanish. Whoa, that was the whole thing. But so a lot of the women who were involved in not just creating Mishfest, but really creating a Mishfest community, a lot of them were anti-SM, anti-trans, TERFs, the whole spiel. I had heard about the Michigan Women's Fest and I was like, oh, so I had just come out. But I spent the summer of 1990 driving to Mexico. So I went 1990, no, it was 89. So I spent 91, I went to Mishfest and I was there as they were like picking the new Leather Dykes and it ended up being on Twilight Zone. And so for many years, I was part of the like old guard holding it down in the Twilight Zone as other women sort of like snuck away from downtown in the middle of the night because you didn't want your other lesbian friends to know you had an interest in SM because that could be used to ostracize you in your community back home, right? So people would like sneak down to the Twilight Zone in the middle of the night. And there was always something happening in the Twilight Zone. And some of us really took it upon ourselves to make sure that folks were actually learning stuff. Because a lot of us were more advanced, doing more rack stuff, risk aware, consensual, things that you wouldn't want like your newbie to sort of start out with. So there were definitely many of us who took it upon ourselves to also make sure that we were that the folks who were sneaking down in the middle of the night, they were also learning something and learning about safety and learning about consent and not just watching us doing the things we were doing.
I can only imagine, and I've got a very good imagination. But I do want to take a moment, though, to just highlight where we are with different kinds of education and how things like when you talk about the old guard, for those that are listening that aren't really know what we're talking about, back in the day, back in the day, when you were interested in BDSM, kink, the leather community, I'm actually holding all of those terms in one pot, but like there wasn't really that you couldn't just go on YouTube and learn. You had to look, you had to find, you had to connect, and there was community around alternative sexuality. And at least in my experience, it was very much like you came in, you learned from the bottom, meaning that you came in learning how to surrender. And hopefully you connected with a mentor who took you through safe, sane, and consensual, meaning that what things can we do safely to the body and the mind? What things can we do sanely? Like there are definitely practices that are not for everybody.
Right. And not necessarily where you don't want to dive into the deep end of the pool.
Right, exactly. And then really, for me, that was the beginning of consent. I mean, it's become a much bigger, much broader, much more nuanced conversation, but like the idea of negotiating with someone about the way you're going to play together, that's sort of been much of the foundation around like, how do we talk about sex and how do we negotiate and connect with partners around creating the erotic ecstatic? What are the things that need to be in place to have those kinds of experiences? And I'm curious, like, so if you were to talk a little bit about what needs to be in place to have that kind of an experience, what would you say are some of the foundational pieces?
The ability to communicate your wants, your needs, and the things that you might be interested in trying. The ability to communicate what you absolutely positively don't want, and the ability to know fully that your partner will respect that. And the ability to also talk about the things that you're like, that's not going to really do much for me, but if it gets you off, I may be willing to try it. And an imagination. And also, there was the thing that in some communities, some SM communities that I found that was a real turnoff, where people seem to really take this idea that like bottoms were community property, or not necessarily community property, but like bottoms existed for the pleasure of the top. They didn't really have a lot of say in how things run. And I was like, bottoms are a gift. Anybody that's giving you and showing you that kind of trust, like you need to worship them. And there are ways in which more experienced bottoms than me taught me. I'm kind of a top heavy switch. I'm a switch, but rarely. More so as I've gotten older, but rarely. But so there were experienced bottoms that taught me how to do things as a top safely. And there were more experienced bottoms who validated parts of my top persona, for lack of a better word. Like without bottoms, you're just a bunch of like fucking like cruel, like you're just a bunch of like sadists. Like, and I don't mean sadists in the good way. You're like, without the consent of the bottom, you're like somebody that needs to be put away. So thank you, bottoms, for not just allowing us, but wanting us to do all those cruel, torturous things too. But I mean, emotionally, physically, if it hadn't been for a lot of the more experienced bottoms that I learned from, like they really had a lot to do with how I approach play, how I approach what I see as quote unquote permissible and what is not. And like, if you can find someone who wants to do the thing that you want to do, it's permissible. And as long as you're both really aware of what the actual risks are, and then you get to decide whether or not you want to take those risks, and not shaming or judging someone who says, I don't want to take that risk. I understand what the risks are of that activity. I decide I don't want to do that. And also not judging or belittling people. Say, I fully understand what the risks are for that, and that makes me hot and I want to try it anyway. And trusting that they actually do understand fully what the risks are for things like knife play, branding, clay piercing, choking, and breath play. Workshop at IMSL. So I've taught a bunch of workshops at IMSL, and I was doing erotic breathwork was like the title of the, and I would like bump into people in the elevator or whatever, and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I missed your breath play workshop." And I'd be like, "No, very different thing, not at all the same." And for those who don't know, breath play, at least in the SM sense, is around modulating or limiting someone's ability to breathe. And that is very different. Breath play is very different from breath. And so I think that first time I taught, I must have spent like 3 or 4 times a day being somebody like, "Oh, when's your breath play?" Nope, I'm not doing a breath play workshop. It's erotic breath work.
That's a great segue into, please tell me more about erotic breath work, especially the way you think about it and the way you teach it.
So I owe a lot about, and I speak his name at the beginning of all of my workshops as part of my Finny ancestor. Chester Maynard gave me words to understand the breath for things I was already doing, and then taught me more about the breath than I ever thought was possible. And so for me, some of the key things about my particular, and one of the things I always tell people, like, there's no wrong way to breathe, right? As long as you're breathing mindfully, it's all good. My particular form of breath work, however, one, we don't put a lot of efforting into it. So I think it's a holotropic breath work where it's all like, oh, they're like really like huffing something. We don't do that here to King T'Challa. We don't do that here. And really, I call it erotic breath work because it's about connecting with that, the most deepest, strongest, most fundamental energy in the body, and that is eros. And a lot of times when I'm talking about erotic breathwork, people think I'm just using that as like a euphemism for sex. But when I'm talking about the erotic, I'm really using Audre Lorde's work. So there's an essay that she wrote, oh God, is it 50 years? A really long time ago, called The Use of the Erotic is Power. And that really is my personal, professional, and political manifesto when it comes to eros. Anyway, so eros is that deepest life force that, for me, it's also about how we understand our bodies as sacred vessels, and how we understand that God, and I'm using that as shorthand, and I hate using that as shorthand because I'm not a Christian, but people understand me. The creatrix, let's say, the creatrix does not exist outside of ourselves. The creatrix exists inside of ourselves. And so how do we have that communication with the creatrix? How do we remember our inherent sacredness? We use the breath to travel inward. So here's a little example for what I'm talking about. In my tradition, I practice Ifa, which is a pre-Christian African, specifically Yoruba West African spiritual tradition, and also a science. And when you get initiated, prior to getting initiated, you get these pots. I'm making air quotes. You get these pots. And then you also get some pots when you're initiated. And you, as the initiate, do not get to see what's in the pot. The elders open the pot and put stuff in the pot. And for people who don't understand, they might say, what's in the pot represents the gods. But no, it's an actual piece of the Orisha is in that pot. It's not something that represents. It is a piece of the Orisha in that pot. And so that's what our bodies are, these pots. There's a piece of the universe. There's a piece of the creatrix in, like, we house, or one of the things I say, we are minute manifestations of the divine. So our sacred, our physical containers house this sacred piece of us. And one way to access that is to use the breath as a vehicle for that traveling inward, and also using it as an anchor to ground. So we use the breath to come into deeper, more authentic relationship with ourselves, with our body. And in doing so, it becomes possible to communicate with the divine. And that all comes from the breath. And it's a relaxed breath, and it is a steady breath. And most importantly, the jaw and the butthole. I hold community breathwork sessions every month, and I always say to newcomers, I'm going to talk about your butthole a lot. Just get ready. So we have to have a relaxed jaw and a relaxed butthole, because we're holding it. When we're tense, energy can't flow through us. So we have to relax so that the energy can flow through us. So I'm often talking about people's buttholes. What else is different?
I love that. I just have to pause you for just a second. So first of all, I want to go back for just a moment. And so talking about spirit, God, being within ourselves, and using the breath work as a vehicle to connect with that part of ourself. So to me, that sounds like what you're saying is it's an integration of our earthly bodies and our spiritual experience. Is that?
I'll go for that. I also have started recently because recently means like in the last 10 years. So I've also recently been talking about bodies, plural. So our physical bodies, our emotional bodies, and our energetic or spiritual bodies. To me, I think energetic body, but I always worry that if I say energetic, people think I mean like enthusiastic. So then I'll say, no, I mean your spiritual body. And so I talk about the multiplicity of those bodies and how they are the same but aren't the same, and how you can use the breath to communicate and to integrate all of the bodies into one, and also to be specific about which body you're in communication with. So I can use the breath, we can use the breath to integrate the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical bodies. And I can also be really specific. Oh, I have chronic pain in my left hip. How am I going to use my breath to remediate that physical pain in my left hip? So that I'm being specific about using the breath for my physical body. Or I have a spiritual wound because I grew up Catholic and queer. I didn't want to use that as an example. I grew up Catholic and queer, and the priest told me I was going to hell and that the devil had taken hold of me. So now I have the spiritual wound. So how do I use the breath to heal this spiritual wound? I talk about using the breath to heal emotional. Let me think about that. But a lot of times differentiating between using the breath to address something in the physical body versus using the breath to address something in the spiritual or energetic body. And a lot of it is about intention. And a lot of it is also about visualization. Chester had this thing about, I'm not going to say as great as he did, but he was like, we don't do imagination because imagination is like you're pretending. And so I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to visualize something that actually, except for he said it much better. So there's a lot of, I try to help people visualize particular things like the shaft where the energy centers in some traditions called chakras, but many traditions have this concept of energy centers in different parts of the body. So the one that I feel like people can get easier is this sort of main channel in the middle of the body. So we talk about visualizing that and visualizing the light moving between different energy centers and between the perineum and the crown of the head. What else makes my breath work different? And also, my former godmother died before we could have a more of an in-depth conversation about this. But I have been talking to her about the orishas and the chakras and how they might be connected. She was like, oh yeah. And then we like never got back to having that conversation. So there's a way that I also incorporate particular things from Ifa into my breath work, particularly Oshun, who is the simplest way to talk about her, and also the most incorrect. But the simplest way to talk about her would be to say, she's a goddess of sex, love, and beauty. And that is like a overly simplistic and overly restrictive description of what she is responsible for. But anyway, I use a lot of Oshun stuff when I am teaching breath work.
So it sounds like not only are you bringing together your experience in the Western world, your experience from African spirituality, your experience from your life path, which is wide and vast. And I love what I read earlier in your bio about your experience of living. Let's see, I'm actually going to go back to see it. It's like your lived experience of being fat, Black, queer, femme, all of these pieces you bring together. And so they run through your work. And if somebody wants a chance to actually experience you, I mean, your transmission is amazing. And I'm so thrilled to get to spend this time with you. But if somebody wants to get a chance to experience you, how do they do that?
Well, the easiest way with the way with the least amount of investment would be to come to one of my monthly sessions. So the first Sunday of every month, I host something called Black Breath Matters, and that is exclusively for Black folks. And we use erotic breath work to process what it means to live in a body that's racialized by the state. And all of the things that brings up, which are myriad and can be different from week to week. So that is a closed circle. And then every third Sunday, I do butthole breathing for the win. And I call it butthole breathing because many of my students and many of my friends who have come to my other events, they're like, "Oh, you're talking about breathing through your butthole." I'm like, "Okay, that we can describe it that way." That's not how I describe it. We can describe it that way. So now I call it butthole breathing. And that's every third Sunday. So the easiest way to get in touch with me is to go through my website, which is fiercepassions.com. And one easy way to remember that is that Imkali Hashiki is Swahili for fierce passion. But fierce passion was taken as URL, so I have to add an S on it. So it's fiercepassions.com. And there folks can read more about my work. They can register for an event. If they're interested in working with me one-on-one, there's ways to contact me and set up schedule discovery calls. So it's all on my website. I never people if I can help it.
Awesome. And of course, these things will all be in the show notes. And so I'm curious if somebody was listening to this amazing conversation and followed us to all of the incredible locations we went to. Would be one thing that you would want them to walk away with? Like, there's so many incredible gems here, but what would be this one thing that you want to transmit away to somebody who's listening?
The one thing I would want people to know is that the body and its pleasures, its physical pleasures, there is no way that they can be blasphemous or evil, as long as there's consent, right? You're not forcing anyone to do something. So that anyone who would tell you that your pleasures are wrong, are evil, they themselves they're not coming from the right place, because that's not true. That's not possible. You were created, your physical being is created as a sacred object, and the pleasure, like there's a reason why the fucking clitoris has a gajillion fucking nerve endings. It's not just for shits and giggles, right? Like we want to talk intelligent design, which I don't, but if we were going to talk intelligent design, like that was on purpose. There's a reason the head of the penis has all of these erogenous nerve endings. There's a reason that the anal sphincter has all of these nerve endings. And it's not just so you can feel yourself shit. Like pleasure is part of the reason that the physical body exists. And so as long as you are not harming anyone, as long as you are getting consent, there's nothing wrong that you can do for your pleasure. So explore on your own. What does your body want? And maybe what your body wants has nothing to do with what society tells you your body is supposed to want based on your age, race, gender, size, ability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Explore for yourself what makes your body feel good.
That is so good. I got goosebumps when you were talking about that. So yes, Well, thank you so incredibly very much.
Oh my God, it's been an hour.
Time. Yeah, for taking the time to be with me today and to share your experience. And I am looking forward to seeing more of what you're up to.
Oh,
So,
great. This has been wonderful. I love having these conversations because they really shake loose a lot of things. For when I had the whole thing about when you articulate something, you make it smaller, but also being able to articulate it gives it form. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to like give form to some of the things I've been thinking or sitting with for decades now. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And for those of you listening, again, this has been the Better Sex Podcast. Please like, comment, follow, subscribe to the podcast, and please check out fiercepassions.com to learn more. And on that note, may your sex and your pleasure be awesome.